Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of like absolute precision. It's almost like engineering.
Right. Yeah. Very mechanical.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that stark, jagged white line right across the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
It's a binary state, broken or not broken.
Right. It's clean.
Yep.
The cause and effect are totally viable. And honestly, I think there's something deeply comforting about that. We like our problems to be visible, to be categorized, and most importantly, to be simple.
Oh, absolutely. But then you step into the world of complex systems, whether that's neurodevelopment, chronic illness, or in our case today, global geopolitics, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just fundamentally broken.
Yeah.
You're staring at shadows. You are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely, completely murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And frankly, that is exactly the sensation we are going to experience today on this deep dive. What if I told you, the listener, that the Cold War, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the internet you are using right at this very second were all engineered by the exact same hidden hand?
It's a massive claim.
It's huge. We are looking at an X-ray of global history, of modern political power, of terrifying public health crises, and the jagged white line we are being asked to look at in today's stack of sources defies absolutely everything we've ever been taught to see.
The material we are unpacking today is staggering in its scope. I mean, it really is an overarching, grand, unified theory of an alternate reality.
Yeah.
The core thesis of the documents, the articles, and these historical texts we're examining is that all roads of global manipulation, and we are talking about centuries of orchestrated events, lead directly back to Rome.
All roads.
Literally all of them. Specifically, the claim is that the Vatican, the Jesuit order, the Knights of Malta, and what these authors refer to as the Deep Church are the actual architects of modern history. They argue that the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, wasn't just a health crisis.
Right.
It was an emergency protocol, a cover-up deliberately deployed to distract the global public from horrific elite trafficking scandals, specifically things like Pizzagate, and to simultaneously roll out a totalitarian internet censorship machine.
Okay, now, before we go a single step further, I need to speak directly to you, the listener. We have to establish some incredibly important ground rules for this specific deep dive. We are looking at a curated stack of highly controversial, politically charged, and honestly deeply disturbing allegations today.
Very disturbing, yeah.
These sources implicate major world governments, powerful right-wing and left-wing political figures, billionaire philanthropists, and, one of the largest, most influential religious institutions on planet Earth. Because of this, we must state clearly and unequivocally, we are absolutely not taking sides.
That is a critical baseline for us today.
Completely.
Our role here is strictly analytical. We are not endorsing, validating, confirming, or condemning the viewpoints, theories, or these massive allegations contained in these documents. Our sole job is to impartially report on the content provided to us, to decode the complex arguments being made, and to convey the ideas contained strictly within this original source material.
Right.
We just want you to understand the intricate architecture of this specific worldview, nothing more.
Okay, with that vital disclaimer securely in place, let's look at the map of the incredibly dark rabbit hole we are about to go down. We really have to start in the ashes of World War II, looking at the historical blueprints. How did the Vatican allegedly absorb a terrifying intelligence apparatus?
That's the foundation of everything else.
Exactly. Because once we understand that, we can look at how that newly formed apparatus supposedly manufactured the Cold War as this multi-decade grand illusion. From there, we follow the timeline to the modern era, the pivot from nuclear fear to biological fear.
The pandemic era.
Right. Examining the COVID-19 pandemic is a mechanism of absolute lockstep control. And why did they need that control right then? We'll examine what these authors claim the elites were desperately trying to hide, which is this dark, occult underbelly of elite trafficking networks. And finally, we will look at the digital censorship machine built to silence anyone trying to connect these dots online.
So, to understand how these documents claim modern crises are engineered, we really have to wipe the slate clean on how we view historical institutions. The narrative here demands that we stop looking at the Vatican as a spiritual headquarters.
Right, take the religion out of it entirely.
Exactly, and instead view it as a highly sophisticated sovereign intelligence agency.
Let's start right there with the architects, the Jesuits. Because when you read through these texts, the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, is repeatedly framed not just as an order of priests or educators, but literally as the Catholic branch of the Illuminati.
The terminology they use is very specific.
It really is.
Yeah.
There is a quote heavily referenced in the material from a 19th century theologian named Luigi de Sanctis. He essentially argues that the Jesuits only present the greater glory of God on the surface, but in reality, behind closed doors, he says, they aim at universal dominion alone.
Universal dominion.
Yeah. They are portrayed throughout these historical documents as having this immense, almost supernatural capability to subvert sovereign governments, orchestrate revolutions, and operate completely above the law.
And the authors pinpoint a very specific, pivotal historical moment where this theoretical ambition supposedly weaponized itself with modern geopolitical and military power. That moment is the immediate aftermath of World War II.
Okay.
When Europe was in absolute ruins, the texts detail the creation and operation of something called the rat lines.
Right. Now, I had heard that term before, usually in like spy novels or movies, but the mechanics described here are chilling. Walk us through how the sources define these rat lines.
According to the documents, the rat lines were highly organized, Vatican-run smuggling networks. They were allegedly overseen by high-ranking figures within the church, specifically naming an Austrian bishop, Alois Hudal, and a Croatian priest named Father Krunoslav Draganovic.
Okay, and what were they smuggling?
People. Specifically, the claim is that these networks systematically helped prominent ex-Nazis, fascists, and war criminals escape justice at the Nuremberg trials. They moved them down through Italy, often literally sheltering them in monasteries, and smuggled them to South America, places like Argentina, and even into the United States under classified intelligence programs like Operation Paperclip.
Which, just to clarify for everyone listening, Operation Paperclip was a real, historically documented U.S. intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists, like Wernher von Braun, to America to work on the space program and military technology. The sources are taking that known history and expanding it, saying the Vatican was the primary facilitator for the worst of the worst, not just the rocket scientists.
Exactly. They cite a specific 1947 U.S. intelligence report by an agent named Vincent LaVista. LaVista's report allegedly confirms that the Vatican Information Service was functioning entirely as an espionage ring. And the logistics of how this worked are fascinating in a very grim way. You really have to ask, how does a bishop get a wanted SS officer across the Atlantic Ocean?
Right, because you can't just buy a ticket on a luxury liner if you're literally on the Allied Most Wanted list. You don't have a passport.
The mechanism relied completely on the Vatican's unique status as a sovereign state. The authors claim the Church utilized its relationship with the International Red Cross in Rome to issue stateless person travel documents.
Wow.
Yeah, because the Vatican essentially vouched for these individuals, often giving them brand new identities as Catholic refugees fleeing communist persecution in Eastern Europe. The Red Cross issued the papers. The Allied forces, largely wanting to avoid conflict with the Vatican and already pivoting their attention to the Soviet Union, largely turned a blind eye.
And it wasn't just a humanitarian blind spot, right? I mean, the texts are adamant that this wasn't some misguided act of Christian forgiveness for sinners. It was a highly calculated, massively funded intelligence operation. There's a 1946 Treasury agent memo mentioned in the reading claiming that roughly $225 million in stolen Nazi gold ended up routed to the Vatican to fund these exact smuggling operations.
The financial aspect is absolutely crucial to the argument here. The central question these sources pose to the reader is why? Why would an ancient institution founded on spiritual purity, one that supposedly stands for ultimate moral good, go out of its way to absorb and protect the most notorious war criminals of the 20th century?
I mean, the leap in logic feels massive.
It does. But the authors provide a deeply cynical, very pragmatic answer. They argue it was to create a black orchestra of intelligence. The Vatican, foreseeing the rise of the Soviet Union and global communism as the ultimate existential threat to its power and its property, essentially merged its interests with U.S. and British intelligence.
They needed soldiers for the next war.
Precisely. They needed ruthless, experienced, anti-communist operatives who already knew the terrain of Central and Eastern Europe. The surviving Nazis and fascist intelligence officers fit that job description perfectly. They hated the communists, they had existing spy networks, and they were desperate for protection.
So it was a marriage of convenience.
Very much so. The documents claim the Vatican helped form networks like Intermarium, which was a covert anti-communist coalition spanning Eastern Europe. The ultimate irony presented in the text, though, is that these networks were allegedly being manipulated not just by the Vatican and Western intelligence, but eventually infiltrated and used by Soviet intelligence as well.
I have to pause here because the moral reality the sources are asking us to accept is just staggering. It's like watching a massive, publicly beloved corporation execute a hostile takeover of a disgraced criminal rival company. They know the rival company committed massive fraud, hurt people, broke every law on the books.
Right. But they execute the takeover anyway, just to acquire their ruthless top executives. They completely ignore the horrific crimes because those specific cutthroat skill sets are deemed absolutely necessary to win the next corporate war.
That is a very apt analogy for what the material describes. The Vatican needed the ruthless executives of the Third Reich to fight the impending war against the Soviets. And if we extrapolate from that, think about the psychological impact on the global public if this narrative were widely accepted as historical truth.
It would break people.
It would. The Mother Church, the ultimate moral compass for over 1 billion people on Earth, is entirely recontextualized. It is no longer a spiritual guide. It is a sovereign intelligence agency wielding what the texts call temporal power, meaning earthly, political, and military power over world affairs. It fundamentally shatters the illusion of moral authority, replacing it with sheer Machiavellian pragmatism. It changes the entire lens through which you view the 20th century. Which brings us to the next massive phase of this alleged master plan. If the Vatican, the Jesuits, and Western intelligence absorbed all these dark operatives to fight communism, what did that fight actually look like? Because according to the sources, it didn't look like a real war. It looked like a carefully choreographed hoax.
The narrative takes a massive paradigm-shifting turn as we enter the atomic age. How did this post-World War II espionage apparatus evolve? The texts claim it morphed directly into the Cold War, but they argue the Cold War was a staged conflict.
Staged.
A global psychological operation designed to distract the public while the Vatican consolidated its power behind the scenes.
They literally describe the Cold War in the reading as an airborne nuclear war hoax. That phrase just jumped off the page at me. They are claiming that the 40-year theatrical standoff between the United States and the USSR, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the junk and cover drills in schools, the space race was entirely manufactured. The texts argue that the CIA and the KGB were not actually mortal enemies fighting for the soul of the world.
No, not according to this.
Right. Instead, they are characterized as two distinct wings of the same bird. They are both subordinate to the Vatican's international intelligence community.
We really have to unpack the underlying mechanism of this Vatican-Moscow-Washington alliance that the sources propose, because the immediate question is, why fake a war? If the Cold War wasn't about a genuine ideological struggle between Western capitalism and Eastern communism, what was its functional purpose?
Right. Who benefits from 40 years of fake panic?
The documents suggest it was the most brilliant mechanism for domestic control ever invented. By perpetually terrifying the populations of both the West and the East with the imminent threat of global nuclear annihilation, governments could achieve several things simultaneously.
Oh, like what?
First, they could justify immense, unprecedented taxation without public pushback. I mean, if you think the world is ending tomorrow, you don't argue about the defense budget.
That's very true.
Second, they could build massive, incredibly profitable military-industrial complexes, funneling trillions of dollars directly to defense contractors. And third, they could heavily suppress any domestic populations labeled as subversive, liberal, or heretical under the ironclad guise of national security.
Okay, let me push back on this, because the sheer scale of coordination required for this theory is mind-bending. I understand the motive fear is a great way to control a population. We've seen that historically. But how do you get mortal enemies, distinct cultures with distinct languages and governments, to play-act a nuclear standoff for decades without someone at the Pentagon or the Kremlin blowing the whistle?
That is the natural friction point of the theory. It requires airtight control.
To me, it's like discovering the two rival sports teams that have been battling for the championship for 40 years, teams with rabid fan bases that literally hate each other. Players who tackle each other to the ground are actually owned by the exact same billionaire. And this billionaire is just sitting up in the owner's box, fixing the matches, deciding who wins each year just to make sure both stadiums sell out and both sides buy the merchandise.
Yeah.
The players on the field might think they are really competing, but the outcome is predetermined.
And to address that very valid pushback, how do you keep the players from realizing the game is fixed? The sources offer a brutal explanation. They argue that anyone who recognized the fixed match, Anyone who saw the strings and tried to oppose this Jesuit-run global policy was simply eliminated.
Just wiped off the board.
The architects of the system did not tolerate disruption.
And they give a very prominent, very explosive example of this in the reading.
They do. The most prominent example detailed in the text is the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The documents explicitly allege that JFK was not killed by a lone gunman, nor was it just a rogue CIA operation. They claim he was murdered by the Jesuits.
The Jesuits.
Yes. The operation was allegedly carried out via the Knights of Malta and high-ranking Catholic figures like Cardinal Francis Spellman in New York.
And the motive, according to this narrative, wasn't just about Vietnam or the Bay of Pigs.
No, the motive was structural. The texts argue that Kennedy dared to interfere with the Pope's international intelligence community. He wanted to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, which meant he was threatening to dismantle the very apparatus the Vatican had spent the post-World War II era building. He was a rogue player who realized the game was rigged, and so he was violently removed.
If we follow the logic of these authors all the way down to the bedrock, what does this imply about the illusion of democracy? If voting, foreign policy, presidential assassinations, and global conflicts are just theater directed by the Black Pope, which, for the listener, is the title given in the text to the superior general of the Jesuit order, then our entire concept of self-determination is a mirage. We don't elect leaders, we elect actors. We are just the captive audience in a very dark, incredibly expensive, multi-generational play.
And that realization is essential for understanding the rest of the material, because eventually historical realities change. The Soviet Union structurally collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the Cold War ended. The primary mechanism of fear that had controlled the global population, the threat of a sudden fiery nuclear apocalypse, it lost its psychological potency.
Yeah, a whole new generation grew up without the fear of mutually assured destruction. The threat just wasn't there anymore.
The script basically ran out of pages. The geopolitical script needed a massive rewrite to maintain that state of perpetual emergency and control. The architects needed a new, invisible enemy.
And that brings us to the pivot, the biological era. As the Cold War fear mechanism faded into history textbooks, the sources claim the Vatican and the deeply entrenched intelligence state shifted their focus from the threat of nuclear annihilation to the threat of microscopic annihilation, pandemics. And what's fascinating is that they allege this wasn't just a sudden pivot in 2019. This was a long game.
A very long game. The texts outline a dark, hidden history of what they claim are laboratory-created diseases used as stepping stones. For instance, they cite a 1972 World Health Organization smallpox vaccination program operating in Africa. The staggering allegation here is that these vaccines were intentionally laced with the HIV virus.
Just to pause on that, that is a claim that entirely upends the accepted history of the AIDS epidemic.
It does, completely. And the stated motive in the texts is brutal, a calculated population reduction program targeting the growing African demographic, orchestrated by global elites who viewed the population boom as a threat to resource control. The documents also casually lump other terrifying outbreaks like Ebola and the bird flu into this exact same category. They frame them as engineered biological weapons, beta tests designed to keep mankind uneasy, dependent on medical intervention, and in a constant state of low-level fear.
And this historical framing of weaponized medicine leads us directly into their analysis of the event that changed all of our lives, the COVID-19 pandemic. This is where the narrative ties the concept of all pandemics lead to Rome together. We have extensive quotes in the material from a very polarizing figure, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano. His public letters and claims are absolutely central to this part of the narrative.
Vigano is a fascinating figure because he is a high-ranking insider. He was the apostolic nuncio to the United States. When he is speaking with the vocabulary and authority of the church hierarchy, but he has essentially gone rogue against the current Vatican administration.
Right, and he pulls absolutely no punches. He calls the entire COVID-19 pandemic a colossal deception. According to Vigano's writings in our sources, the health measures we all lived through, the unprecedented global lockdowns, the curfews, the mask mandates, the forced closures of businesses, and what he terms the experimental gene therapies, meaning the mRNA vaccines, were not public health mistakes or overreactions.
No, he says they were deliberate.
He argues they were deliberately illogical and contradictory. They were designed to be a false problem, intentionally created to impose total unified population control.
Let's analyze the deep ideological shift Vigano and the other authors are describing here. They argue that in the modern secular era, the architects of control realized that people no longer feared hellfire in the way they used to centuries ago. So they needed a new religion. The texts claim that medical professionals, virologists, epidemiologists, public health officials have been elevated to the status of new priests of a pandemic religion.
I really felt that during 2020. The daily press briefings felt almost liturgical, like we were receiving the word from on high.
Exactly. Just as the church historically possessed an aura of absolute infallibility where questioning a priest was literal heresy, now the science possesses that aura. These modern high priests are rendered completely exempt from criticism, even when their dictates directly contradict observable evidence or when they are exposed having massive financial conflicts of interest with multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies. The public is conditioned to obey them without question. To question the virologist is to become a modern-day heretic, a science denier.
And the sources claim this wasn't improvised. They had a playbook. They point to a very specific publicly available document to prove premeditation. They cite a 2010 Rockefeller Foundation document titled Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. Within that document, there is a specific scenario actually named lockstep.
The lockstep scenario is a crucial piece of evidence in their argument.
The texts claim this 2010 document anticipated, or rather, planned everything we witnessed a decade later during COVID. It describes a world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership. It outlines the canceling of small independent businesses to consolidate wealth into massive international mega-corporations. It discusses the demolition of traditional education via distance learning, making citizens entirely reliant on digital interfaces and enforcing strict compliance through biometric tracking.
Because the ultimate goal, according to these unified sources, is physical and biological enslavement. Vigano explicitly takes aim at the Green Pass, the digital vaccine passports utilized extensively in Europe and notably adopted within the walls of the Vatican itself. He doesn't just call it government overreach, he frames it in apocalyptic terms as the biblical mark of the beast.
Oh.
Yeah, the logic being you cannot buy, sell, or participate in society without it. He argues this is the ultimate proof of the deep church fully subordinating itself to the deep state. They have merged. Furthermore, the texts return to that brutal motive we discussed with the 1970s WHO program's depopulation. They heavily cite public quotes from figures like Bill Gates, specifically referencing a TED Talk where Gates discusses lowering the projected global population growth by 10 or 15% through the use of new vaccines, healthcare, and reproductive services.
Okay, I have to challenge this specific motive. I can follow the logic of wanting control, wealth, and power. But the depopulation motive, if the ultimate goal of these elites, the Vatican, the Jesuits, the globalists, is total planetary dominion and absolute control over humanity, why kill off your subjects with lab-created viruses and lethal vaccines? A king needs subjects to rule, right? An empty planet doesn't generate wealth.
It's a very rational, valid, logical challenge. How do you consolidate power by destroying your own workforce?
Right. To me, it feels like a massive contradiction. Unless you look at it through the dark logic of pruning a massive, ancient, overgrown tree.
Pruning the tree.
Right. If you are the gardener and the tree has grown so wild and massive that you can no longer reach the top branches, you feel like you were losing control of it. You don't chop the tree down entirely because you still want the fruit. Instead, you aggressively, violently prune the branches. You stunt its natural growth. You cut it back so severely that the remaining structure is entirely dependent on you, the gardener, for water and support. It becomes smaller, vastly more manageable, and much easier to shape exactly how you want it.
That pruning metaphor is exceptionally accurate to how the authors of these documents view the mechanics of elite control. And they back up that concept by drawing direct historical parallels. The texts argue that the Vatican has done this before. They draw a straight line between the modern COVID-19 lockdowns and the historical weaponization of the Black Death. One source provides a fascinating historical account, claiming that during the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation in the 1540s, a diabolical conspiracy was formed to artificially spread the plague in the city of Geneva.
Wait, artificially spread the bubonic plague? How would they even do that back then?
According to the claim, conspirators were paid to smear infectious matter on the door handles and locks of the city. The goal was to decimate the Protestant stronghold, profit from the spoils of the dead, and allow the Catholic forces to maintain control over the region. Whether historically verified or not, the sources use this to present a centuries-old, consistent playbook, create or weaponize a terrifying disease, position the church or the state as the only salvation, aggressively prune the population of dissidents, and consolidate absolute power in the ensuing panic.
Okay, so if the COVID pandemic was a manufactured emergency used to lock down the world, destroy independent wealth, and implement digital tracking,
Yeah.
what triggered it? Why 2019? Why pull the emergency ripcord right then?
This is where the narrative bridges the gap between global public health policies and the criminal, occult underbelly of the elite class. The sources suggest the pandemic wasn't just a power grab, it was a desperate cover-up.
I must warn you, the listener. Right now, this is the darkest, most disturbing part of the sources we are reviewing today. We are moving into an area that deals with the abuse of children and occult practices. The text suggests that the elites were on the verge of being completely exposed. They point directly to the 2016 Pizzagate scandal and the subsequent unsealing of the Jeffrey Epstein files as the catastrophic catalyst that forced the elites to deploy the pandemic protocol.
The narrative here is that the internet was getting too close to the truth. Let's unpack the Pizzagate claims precisely as they are presented in the texts, because the details matter for understanding their overall argument.
Right. So the theory originated in the lead-up to the 2016 U.S. presidential election when the personal emails of John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, were hacked and subsequently published in full by WikiLeaks. The sources argue that when ordinary people began reading these emails, they found an abundance of bizarre, completely nonsensical references to food.
They weren't reading like normal political correspondence at all.
Not at all. You had highly educated, powerful political operatives discussing things like playing dominoes on cheese rather than pasta. You had emails urgently asking if a handkerchief with a map that seems pizza-related was left behind at a house. You had casual references to flying in hot dogs from Chicago for a private party.
According to the documents provided to us, investigators, open-source intelligence analysts, and researchers within online communities deduced that these specific food terms, pizza, hot dogs, cheese, grape soda, walnut sauce, were not innocent culinary discussions. They argue these were established code words used by pedophiles to discuss illicit acts and the trafficking of minors. They point out that cheese pizza shares the exact same initials as child pornography.
And the texts argue that this coded language isn't just an internet conspiracy theory, because they claim it parallels the exact type of cryptic language later revealed in the Jeffrey Epstein files and flight logs. In their view, the undeniable reality of Epstein's Island provides retroactive credibility to the 2016 Pizzagate allegations. They are basically saying, look, we told you they spoke in code, and Epstein proved they were actually trafficking kids.
The epicenter of this specific theory in 2016 focused on a popular, family-friendly restaurant in Washington, D.C. called Comet Ping Pong, which was owned by a man named James Alefantis, who was highly connected in political circles. The sources dive incredibly deep into the visual codes and the aesthetics surrounding this establishment.
The visual evidence they present is deeply unsettling. They cite a 2007 unclassified FBI document that details specific symbols used by pedophile networks to identify each other. The texts note that the logo for Comet Ping Pong, as well as logos for other associated businesses in the area, closely resembled the FBI's documented symbol for boy love, which is a distinct spiraling triangle.
They don't stop at logos either. They heavily scrutinize Alefantis' public Instagram account at the time. The authors allege that his feed contained highly disturbing, sexualized images of young children, pictures of piñatas filled with condoms, and direct references to occult practices. Specifically, they highlight his connections to Marina Abramovich and her spirit cooking dinners.
For those who don't know, spirit cooking involves bizarre, occult-like performance art, using ingredients like pig's blood, breast milk, and seminal fluid. The sources frame this not as edgy avant-garde art, but as literal, satanic elite rituals. They also reference terrifying pieces of alleged evidence circulating online, like the Skippy video, and references to Frazzle Drip, painting a picture of an elite class engaged in literal blood rituals.
And to move the argument from a single DC pizzeria to a systemic global issue, the sources provide testimony from survivors. The most harrowing is a transcript from a woman named Katie Groves. She testifies about her experience in a CIA-run trafficking ring located in Central Texas, which she chillingly refers to as Uncle Sam's Snuff Factory.
Her descriptions are almost impossible to read. She describes a massive, underground, military-style base where children are systematically tortured, murdered, and filmed. These snuff films, and the children themselves, are allegedly commodified for the black market and for the sadistic gratification of the global elite. She explicitly connects this massive organized crime family operation directly to the CIA, to high-ranking government officials, and ultimately back to the control structures we discussed earlier.
The psychological toll of processing this specific claim cannot be overstated.
It is a massive, terrifying chasm to cross. The gap between reading cryptic emails about ordering pizza and acknowledging the literal physical existence of underground military snuff factories. It's incredibly difficult for the human mind to process. It's like moving into a new house and finding a cryptically locked closet in the hallway. You ask the real estate agent, you ask the mainstream media, and everyone tells you with absolute certainty, oh, it's just a broom closet. Don't worry about it. Nothing to see here.
All right, move along.
But the independent researchers on 4chan look at the blueprints of the house. They trace the heavy electrical wiring going into that wall, and they decide it's actually a hidden high-speed elevator leading down to a subterranean dungeon. The truth presented in these sources is so much darker, so much more depraved than the general public's psychological capacity to accept. It shatters your worldview.
And the authors of these documents argue that this psychological denial is not accidental. It is deliberately weaponized by the elites. They quote the ancient Latin phrase, mundus vult decipi, ergo decipiatur. The world wants to be deceived, therefore let it be deceived. We fundamentally do not want to believe that the politicians we vote for or the billionaires we admire are capable of the horrors behind that veil. But the texts insist the evidence of a massive institutional cover-up is tangible and measurable.
Give us an example of that tangible cover-up from the text.
They point specifically to the Department of Justice's handling of the Epstein files. One researcher cited in the sources conducted a digital forensic analysis of the DOJ's Epstein library. They note that initially, searching the term pizza within those official legal documents yielded 9/11 results.
Okay, 9/11 results for pizza.
Right. But weeks later, when the researcher ran the exact same search, the DOJ had allegedly scrubbed the files, quietly reducing the results to 819. The authors pose a very sharp question. If pizza is just a harmless food item, why is the Department of Justice secretly deleting nearly 100 mentions of the word from the evidentiary files of the world's most prolific child traffickers?
It implies a coordinated sanitization of the evidence. So connecting this all back to the broader thesis of the documents, why? Why do the Vatican, the Jesuits, and the deep state intelligence apparatus facilitate, protect, and participate in these horrific trafficking rings? It can't just be about base depravity. There has to be a functional geopolitical utility to it.
The functional utility is absolute control. The expert analysis within these sources connects these depraved occult practices directly back to the historical deep state control structure we discussed in the first segment regarding the rat lines in the Cold War. The argument is entirely about blackmail.
Blackmail is a currency.
Precisely. These child trafficking and snuff rings, whether it's the one described by Katie Groves in Texas, the operations on Epstein's Island, or the alleged backrooms in D.C., are fundamentally intelligence-gathering operations. By compromising politicians, tech billionaires, judges, and global leaders through their participation in these heinous acts, the hidden elites gather absolute, world-ending blackmail on the people running the planet.
The text mentions specific techniques used to ensure silence, like the right to remain silent, and heavy references to mem-culture mind control and trauma-based programming.
Yes, the idea is that this blackmail is the invisible, unbreakable currency that ensures total, unquestioning loyalty to the New World Order agenda. You cannot step out of line. You cannot vote against the consensus. You cannot expose the corruption if the deep state has you on high-definition film committing an atrocity at Uncle Sam's snuff factory. Mutual assured destruction at an individual level guarantees absolute silence.
Wow. Okay, so let's tie the timeline together. If the internet sleuths in 2016 and the subsequent fallout from Jeffrey Epstein's arrest were getting dangerously close to exposing this entire multi-generational blackmail control structure, the elites were looking at total systemic collapse. They had to shut down the communication channels. The peasants with pitchforks were communicating too quickly online.
Which brings us to the final major pillar of this grand unified theory, the deployment of the censorship industrial complex.
If the public was waking up to the trafficking rings and starting to connect them to the geopolitical manipulations of the Vatican, how do you stop them?
According to the sources, you break the internet. You deploy a global pandemic to lock everyone in their homes, forcing them onto digital platforms, and then you completely control those platforms.
The sources claim an unprecedented, coordinated digital censorship machine was activated under the guise of public health during COVID-19. And the documents provide very specific, legally obtained evidence to prove this isn't just a paranoid theory.
They cite the discovery phase of a massive landmark lawsuit, Missouri versus Biden. This lawsuit forced the release of internal communications from the White House, specifically emails from a man named Rob Flaherty, who was the White House's director of digital strategy at the time. When you read these emails in the source text, they are shocking. These aren't vague requests for cooperation. These are documented, aggressive exchanges where Flaherty is essentially coercing and threatening executives at Facebook, Google, YouTube, and WhatsApp. He demands to know exactly what algorithmic throttles they are using to limit the spread of viral content on private messaging apps, particularly expressing concern about information spreading within minority communities. The tone is demanding, acting as if the tech companies are subordinate branches of the government.
What's absolutely crucial here is what kind of information was being targeted for censorship. The texts emphasize that the government wasn't just trying to take down obvious lies or wild conspiracies. They were demanding the removal of what Facebook internally referred to as often true content.
Often true content.
Yeah, Facebook executives admitted in these emails that the post didn't contain actionable misinformation, but the White House wanted them removed anyway because they could lead to vaccine hesitancy.
They were policing the psychological effect of the truth. The sources highlight how this apparatus specifically targeted and silenced highly credentialed, world-renowned experts. They mention epidemiologists like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford and Martin Kulldorff from Harvard. These men were silenced, shadow banned, and smeared simply because their scientifically well-founded views, such as pointing out the historical efficacy of natural immunity or the devastating collateral damage of lockdowns on children, diverged from the government's required lockstep narrative.
It's the modern equivalent of burning the heretic at the stake, just done via algorithms. And it wasn't just social media hiding current posts. The texts show it was a systematic Orwellian rewriting of recorded reality. They cite an article discussing how the Wayback Machine, which is the Internet's premier, supposedly neutral archiving service, began retroactively labeling deleted articles or controversial past captures as disinformation.
The implications of that are profound. It means the archives of human history are being scrubbed and recontextualized to fit the currently approved narrative. You can't even trust the digital library to show you what was actually written 5 years ago.
The sources outline this as the broader intentional death of Internet freedom. They point to the deep involvement of massive military and intelligence surveillance contractors in building this architecture. They specifically mention billionaire Peter Thiel and his terrifyingly powerful data analytics company, Palantir. The fear explicitly expressed in the texts is that the ultimate goal of this complex isn't just to censor bad opinions. The goal is to unmask, identify, and categorize every single anonymous user on platforms like Discord or Reddit, invoking a level of omnipresent surveillance fear that permanently chills all free speech.
They even cite instances involving modern artificial intelligence. The authors claim that newer AI models, like Elon Musk's Grok, which was billed as an anti-woke, free speech AI, appear to have hidden algorithmic firewalls built right into their code. The AI acts intentionally dumb or completely locks up when queried about certain forbidden subjects, like elite trafficking or the specific mechanisms of the COVID vaccines. The invisible fence is everywhere.
It's a terrifying, dizzying paradox. We are sitting here right now using the internet to read digital sources about how the internet is completely controlled, surveilled, and manipulated. When I first got online in the 90s, the internet was pitched as the ultimate digital Wild West. It was completely untamed, largely anonymous, a true frontier for the total freedom of association and information. But listening to these sources, the sheriffs haven't just come to town to establish order.
They've done a lot more than that.
The sheriffs have paved over the entire desert with concrete. They've installed high-definition facial recognition security cameras on every single cactus. And they are using AI to retroactively erase the map of where the free trails used to be.
That is exactly the architecture of control the documents describe. However, the authors also keenly point out the inherent fatal flaw in this massive censorship model, the Streisand effect.
Right. Explain how the Streisand effect works in this context.
By creating a rigid, authoritarian, binary system of information versus disinformation, with absolutely zero room for nuance, debate, or critical thinking, the tech giants and the government inadvertently validate the very conspiracies they're trying to crush in the minds of the public. When ordinary people see truthful, verifiable epidemiological data from a Stanford professor being labeled as a dangerous hoax simply because it contradicts a White House press briefing, a psychological switch flips. They begin to assume that everything the government labels a hoax is actually the hidden truth.
Right. The censorship becomes the proof of the crime.
Exactly. It enforces unquestioning compliance among a certain segment of the population, but it breeds absolute, radical, unyielding distrust among everyone else.
Which leads to a profound, society-altering speculation. What happens when the critical mass of the public finally realizes that this so-called scientific consensus and the media consensus were not organic? What happens when they realize it was artificially manufactured by government coercion, tech monopolies, and deep state threats? The sources suggest it leads to a total catastrophic collapse of trust in all institutions. If the medical establishment lied, if the legacy media covered it up, if the government enforced it, and the tech companies censored the dissenters, who was left to trust?
And that total collapse of trust, that destabilization of society, is exactly what the architects of this system anticipated and desired, according to the overarching narrative of our sources. You have to break the old world to build the new one.
So let's take a deep breath and try to synthesize this incredibly dense, labyrinthine journey we've just been on. What is the grand takeaway from this massive stack of documents? How do we sum up the thesis of this alternate reality?
The sources present a singular, meticulously unified narrative of global domination. They argue that Rome, specifically the Vatican, the Jesuits, the Knights of Malta, and their associated secret societies, operates as the ultimate hidden hand of human history. They have utilized an evolving, highly sophisticated toolkit of manipulation over the last century. They use the rat lines to absorb ruthless Nazi intelligence and build a black orchestra. They staged the Cold War hoax to build military-industrial power and tax the populace through fear.
And another pivot.
Yes. When that fear faded, they engineered biological pandemics like COVID-19 to impose digital and physical lockstep control. They use horrific, occult blackmail networks like Pizzagate and Epstein to mentally and morally enslave the global elite. And finally, they deployed a massive big tech censorship industrial complex to silence anyone who sees the strings. It is a portrait of total, inescapable planetary dominion achieved through centuries of brilliant, terrifying deceit.
It is heavy, it is incredibly dark, and it forces you to question the foundation of every news story you've ever read. But before we sign off, I promised you, the listener, we would leave you with one final, chilling thread from these sources. It's a thread we haven't fully pulled yet, but it builds perfectly on everything we've just discussed about manufactured fear. The text briefly mentions something called Project Vatican Phase 5.
Ah, yes, the Mount Graham Observatory. This is where the narrative looks to the future.
Exactly. The documents note, factually, that the Vatican maintains an incredibly advanced astronomical observatory on Mount Graham in Arizona, and they note that top Vatican astronomers have openly, publicly discussed the theological implications of discovering extraterrestrial life, even debating the concept of baptizing aliens. But the sources tie this scientific endeavor to something much more sinister. They connect it to quotes from President Ronald Reagan, who famously hinted during a speech at the United Nations that an alien invasion would be the ultimate, perfect event to instantly unify all of humanity under one single global order.
A threat from outside our world.
Precisely. So I leave you with this thought to mull over as you go about your day. If the Cold War was the manufactured, terrifying geopolitical threat of the 20th century, and if the COVID-19 pandemic was the manufactured, biological threat of the early 21st century used to roll out digital tracking, is a staged global UFO and alien crisis the next lockstep mechanism they will use? Is the threat from outer space the final card the architects in Rome will play to cement their absolute, unquestioned control over a terrified, completely unified planet?
It's a terrifying thought.
It really is. Think back to that broken X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning of the show. The jagged white line of simple truth is gone. We are staring into the murky, terrifying, infinitely deep waters of the world's power structures, and the final diagnosis of what is real and what is an illusion is entirely up to you. Thank you for joining us down this incredibly dark and complex rabbit hole. Keep questioning the official narrative, stay infinitely curious, and keep diving deep.